It's commonly believed that drug policy is based on evidence and harm, but it isn't. Because the drugs that cause the most damage are legal, advertised and socially accepted, whilst others are framed as existential threats. So that doesn't word up. Something else is driving the system. Something that shapes what we fear before we ever question it. And if our fear has been engineered, what else have we been trained to believe? Drugs and Addiction, an Anarchist Perspective, Dickie Dredd. This is part 59 in the video series. It's chapter 8, Propaganda, Fear and the Myth of the Addict. So, section 60, Manufacturing Fear, Media as Conditioning. If the previous section revealed how language shaped stigma, this section shows how images enforce it. Every war begins not with bullets but with pictures. The war on drugs was sold through cinema, posters and newsprint, a continuous spectacle of contagion and control. What began as moral panic evolved into a permanent campaign of psychological conditioning, where addiction became the mirror through which society rehearsed its fears. From the reefer madness in 1936 to the British heroin screws you up billboards of the 1980s, governments learned that repetition, threat and reward could modify behaviour more effectively than law. Each image followed the same script: fear the outsider, trust the authority, obey the instruction. In the American films of the 1950s, cannabis led inevitably to psychosis and jazz-fuelled debauchery. In Thatcher's Britain, heroin haunted every tower block. Both projected chaos onto the poor while sanitising the intoxication of the middle class. The couple who drink 2 bottles of wine each night are portrayed as relaxing, while the rave crowd sharing MDMA was demonised as degenerates. Alcohol excess is framed as lifestyle. Collective joy becomes crime. This double standard exposes the class politics of intoxication. As David Nutt's harm studies demonstrated, alcohol and tobacco cause far greater harm than most banned substances, yet they remain culturally sanctified. The discrepancy is not about chemistry, but control. As discussed in section 44, legality protects the substances that sustain economic order and criminalises those that disrupt it. Binge drinking fuels tax revenue and retail profit. Psychedelics and dance culture cultivate solidarity and dissent. One builds the economy, the other builds community. Hence one is advertised and the other outlawed. As an aside, on most public health and economic assessments of alcohol in the UK, gross harms, that's healthcare, crime, lost productivity, etc., outweigh the tax receipts, implying a net loss to society overall rather than a net gain when costs are counted beyond narrow industry GDP contribution. The alcohol industry's economic contribution in jobs, trade, supply chains still supports output and employment, and companies and workers benefit from this activity. But when external costs to public services, economic productivity and social well-being are added up, many studies show a larger financial burden overall. The British state's use of visual propaganda peaked during the 1980s Just Say No era, when the Home Office combined moral panic with pop celebrity. Posters of grey-faced addicts and dying teenagers lined bus stops under slogans such as Don't die before you've lived. The message was simple: pleasure equals death. These campaigns followed a behavioural model borrowed from wartime advertising. Repetition of fear to produce compliance. The Ministry of Information's World War II formula, careless talk costs lives, became careless use costs lives. That the aesthetic hardly changed, only the enemy did. The silk-cut cigarette adverts in the 1980s was pervasive. It was seen everywhere, from billboards to full-page magazine adverts. The adverts depicted scenes from horror films such as Jaws and Psycho Killer. Silk Cut consequently became the most popular brand in the UK by a long mile. Fear sells addiction, and the tobacco industry knew exactly what it was doing. When the health warnings were introduced into cigarette packaging, the prevalence of smoking significantly increased. That's true. Television continued the script. In the 1990s, Channel 4's The Truth About Ecstasy presented scientific uncertainty as danger, cutting between interviews with grieving parents and blurred footage of raves. The editing rhythm mimicking the drug's pulse, the viewer's heartbeat became the medium of control. By the early 2000s, the Talk to Frank campaign had replaced moral threat with irony. The tone softened, but the subtext remained. The state was parent, the user as child. As Hall argued, ideology persists not through censorship, but through framing. The conversation seems open, while its boundaries remain fixed. Media fear-mongering is not random. It serves measurable functions. Sensationalist reporting keeps attention high and nuance low. In 2010, the Daily Mail ran over 100 stories linking skunk cannabis to madness and murder. Despite more than 100 Daily Mail stories linking skunk cannabis to madness and murder, population-level evidence shows that while heavy or high-potency cannabis use is associated with modest increase in psychosis risk, roughly doubling relative risk, but from a low baseline of about 1% lifetime prevalence, there is no credible statistical evidence of a causal link to violence or homicide, and most users experience no such harms. I've got plenty of evidence for that. That was a footnote. I'm going to get back to where I was. Right. Each new moral panic justified tougher policing and further funding. Fear, as Anarchist and Conway noted, in another context, is the most reliable currency of control. The addict, like the terrorist or the immigrant, becomes a figure of moral distraction, scapegoat that allows the public to project anxiety outward. Addiction is the perfect scapegoat for a society addicted to control. The psychological mechanics are well understood. As Pavlov demonstrated, pairing stimulus and punishment creates conditioned avoidance. Governments adapted this principle into fear conditioning, propaganda, associating drugs with disgust until emotion replaced evidence. The advertising industry formalised this as behavioural messaging, later repurposed for public health campaigns. Addiction discourse thus fused moral panic with marketing technique. Where the church once used guilt, the state now used psychology. As discussed in section 45, this alliance between science and commerce ensured that fear remained profitable. Yet the effect of this conditioning has been catastrophic. Public fear has done little to curb use, but much to entrench stigma. The UK's Misuse of Drugs Act in 1971 endures precisely because fear sustains its moral legitimacy. Organised crime, far from shrinking, has thrived under prohibition. In Mexico, Colombia, and across Latin America, American-led propaganda justified militarization under the banner of anti-drug reform, leaving hundreds of thousands dead while demand in the US remained unchanged. The rhetoric of protection masked a policy of expansion. Fear, exported globally, became the lingua franca of control. In the domestic sphere, propaganda reshaped private behaviour through shame. Television dramas such as Casualty and The Bill normalised the addict as public nuisance, while reality programmes such as Intervention presented recovery as spectacle. Compassion was replaced by voyeurism. As Fraser and Moore argue, addiction media constructs morality through empathy fatigue. The viewer is taught to care only through distance. The working class drinker or club goer becomes an object of study rather than solidarity. Digital media multiplies these mechanisms. Click-driven algorithms reward outrage, amplifying fear headlines over harm reduction. Images of drug chaos or spice zombies circulate endlessly, whilst community-led recovery rarely trends. The result is a new kind of conditioning, one that trains attention itself. As Lanier warns, the internet economy profits by addicting the viewer to outrage. Addiction thus becomes both subject and strategy. The same screen that condemns drug users seduces the public into its own dependency. Against this backdrop, anarchist analysis reframes propaganda as pedagogy. The task is not merely to expose lies, but to understand the machinery that makes them persuasive. It's discussed in section 49. Control survives by colonising perception. To dismantle it, we must cultivate media literacy as a form of resistance, learning to decode the spell before it's cast. Community storytelling, citizen documentaries, harm reduction podcasts now perform this work, reclaiming narrative from spectacle. Each story told by users themselves becomes a small act of unconditioning, a rehearsal for autonomy. In the next section, the focus shifts from fear to economy. How stigma and panic translate into profit. The same media that invents deviance also sells its cure. Addiction, we shall see, funds both the police and the pharmacy, both the headline and the prescription. To follow that money is to follow the true motive of control. So the issue was never just about drugs, as we say almost every day. It was the way fear was used to control how we see them, which means the entire system, the laws, the stigma, the panic, is built on perception, not reality. So if fear is foundation, what happens when people stop believing it? And if that fear can be manufactured, who is actually profiting from it? Next up, Chapter 8 still, Propaganda, Fear and the Myth of the Addict. Part 61, The Economics of Stigma.